sounded the alarm about the threat of the coronavirus long before others. He joins us now to talk about our economy and China's role in all this. Senator, you said China should be held responsible for every death and job lost in the pandemic. Why do you say that?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that China is culpable for unleashing this pandemic on the world. First off, as you just reported, all the evidence, circumstantial to be sure, but all the evidence right now points to these laboratories in Wuhan as the most likely source for this virus. Perhaps it was an accidental breach that resulted from Chinese incompetence, but still, they knew the risks, they knew the shortcomings in those labs. But even worse, by late December, early January, once it became clear to the Chinese Communist Party leaders that this virus was highly contagious and deadly and was being transmitted from humans to humans, they continued to encourage travel outside of China to the rest of the world. I believe that was a deliberate decision that was designed to seed cases around the world so China wouldn't be the only nation that suffered a relative decline of its power. That's why I think China is culpable for this pandemic and why there has to be consequences for them.
Senator, that's an awful charge. Do you realize how horrible it would be? I mean, that thing has destroyed the world. I mean, people are going to be suffering. They're starving. There's this pandemic all over the world, and people, the food supply is being compromised. I mean, to think the Chinese did that deliberately?
Xi Jinping and the communist leadership in Beijing would think of nothing at the deaths of hundreds of thousands or even millions of foreign nationals if it meant preserving Chinese power. Let's keep in mind that they currently have more than 1 million religious minorities interned in gulag re-education camps. They force women to have abortions. They harvest organs from political prisoners. And of course, their communist forebears in the Chinese Communist Party, going back to the 1940s, are responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of their own people. Those kinds of people would think of nothing of putting this virus outside of China's borders if that's what it took to maintain China's relative power in the world.
Senator, you know, up in the South China Sea, they're building islands and claiming it's part of China. Do you think we're going to look at a military confrontation with them sometime in the not too distant future?
No, China doesn't want a military confrontation with us, and of course we should never seek military confrontation with any nation. We should try to resolve our differences, and if we can't, achieve our interests in other ways. That's one reason why, for instance, I've said that we need to build up a military that's capable of deterring Chinese aggression in the South China Sea or against our allies, why we need to bring back more manufacturing capacity from China back to the United States, why we need to open America's courts to lawsuits by those who have suffered from this virus against Chinese leaders. There's many other steps that we can take to ensure that China pays the consequences for its misdeeds, well short of any kind of military confrontation.
Well, now, I understand that they really have been supplying a large part of our medicine, our drugs, and they are holding us hostage. They could cut off the supply, and especially of these critical materials, and do us terrible damage.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case, and it's a terrible situation that our leaders in Washington have allowed to develop over the last 30 years. So in the short run, we are dependent on China for basic drugs like ibuprofen or acetaminophen and a lot of the protective equipment that our great doctors and nurses need, like masks or gowns. And China is, in fact, blocking the export of those products to the United States right now. But in the near term, in the months and the years ahead, we cannot allow that situation to continue. That's why we have to bring manufacturing capacity for those critical goods, not just for national defense, but for our public health and safety, out of China and back to the United States.
Are they sending corrupt stuff like fentanyl to us too? I mean, it looks like that's where the source of that mess is coming from.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is just another act of Chinese perfidy. So they intentionally overproduce fentanyl, which does have legitimate pain management purposes, but then they send that surplus fentanyl to Mexico, and the cartels use it to lace their drugs, which they then bring into the United States to poison our own people. And we're losing 70,000 people a year from drug overdoses, especially overdoses laced with fentanyl. Ultimately, that goes back to China. That's why I've proposed legislation in the past that would impose sanctions on Chinese officials who are responsible for sending that fentanyl into our streets.
Listen, are those sanctions going to work, or has there got to be something a little bit more robust to take charge of it? This is terrible what you're talking about. I mean, it's really an act of aggression of the worst sort.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party, like communists everywhere and always, do not value human life. They do not care about freedom. They will do anything to stay in power, and that includes those kinds of aggressive actions against the United States to destabilize our society, to sicken our people, to achieve their goals of increasing their power relative to ours. That's why there's so many steps we have to take to ensure that China doesn't achieve that objective.
Well, Senator, thank you so much for being with us. This is an alarming report, but ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate Senator Cotton and this rather bold statement that he's made.